Thank you, Chair. And in starting, I think it's important to acknowledge the incredible response of the Irish people to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think the outpouring of solidarity and assistance has been incredible, and also incredibly within a short time Ukrainian refugees have established themselves in communities, with children enriching our local schools and adults helping address staff shortages. And I also want to recognise the immediacy of the government's response to the situation, and the Minister in your department in your role in this. The speed and scale of your response is admirable, and it shows what's possible when the government decides to act. It's really important to acknowledge that, so fair play to all of you in the department. But it brings me to my first point, which is, why is the reaction to this crisis so different from the conflicts in Syria and Afghanistan, when there were also families fleeing violence? The Taoiseach said that it was kind of a difference that was only natural, and as Ukraine is in Ireland's what he called neighbourhood. So, Minister, I'm wondering if you agree with the Taoiseach on that, or what's your explanation for the difference in approach? NGOs in the area of asylum and refugee support have expressed concern around the emergence of a two-tiered system. For example, I mentioned Ukrainians can take up work immediately, while people in the asylum system have to wait for months. People from Ukraine, even if living in hotels and hostels, have access to full social protection allowances, while other protection applicants get the much lesser direct provision allowance. And then many people in the international protection process are waiting months for a temporary residence certificate to be issued, whereas in comparison, people from the Ukraine get an expedited PPSN without the need for a temporary protection letter. And I think it's important to note that the temporary residence certificate is crucial as a document because it's necessary to get a PPS number, a medical card, and the daily expenses allowance. These delays prevent access to education and to work, and they're forcing people to live in poverty for weeks and months and more. Some of the points, Minister, I raised 100% relate to other departments, not yours, social protection, but as the kind of coordinating minister, I'm wondering what you think about that emergence of what NGOs are calling a two-tiered system. And will the changes afforded to Ukrainian refugees, now that we've seen what we can do, will they be extended to all people in the international protection process? And in particular, what are you doing to address the delays in accessing temporary residence certificates? Thank you.
I do have to say, and I understand where the questions are coming from, Deputy, but the topic is specific to Ukraine as opposed to the wider situation of direct provision and everything. So if the Minister wants to respond with some of that stuff, isn't for discussion today.
Thanks very much, Deputy Kearns, and just I suppose acknowledging what the Chair has said. But I suppose we and the government are working according to the Temporary Protection Directive. That is an EU directive in terms of directing all 27 member states how it responds to the Ukraine crisis. And it's one, I suppose, I'm very comfortable working with in terms of that it does extend very significant rights to Ukrainian displaced persons when they come to this country. And it does, I believe, enable them to better integrate into society in terms of being able to take up employment rapidly, in terms of being able to kind of engage in the wider sphere. The reasoning why a temporary protection directive was there in the first place, I suppose, is well beyond my pay grade. I suppose we have to recognise that this war and the displacement in this war immediately enters the European Union. People are fleeing not through 2 or 3 or 4 countries. They are immediately leaving Ukraine and entering Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and millions have made that journey already. And I imagine that is the basis behind the construction of the Temporary Protection Directive a number of years ago, and why the treatment of people fleeing a crisis immediately on our borders was seen by the European Union as to be different to those fleeing a crisis at some geographical distance. But I think it is important just to recollect our response to the 2 other crises that you mentioned, Afghanistan and Syria. Since the Syrian crisis broke out, just 3,500 Syrian refugees have been relocated to Ireland as part of the Irish Refugee Protection Programme 1 and 2. and they are settled in communities all over the country. Some of that has been done through community sponsorship, which I'm sure you're familiar with, these amazing community groups that come together and support families. They provide accommodation, but they also provide that support as well, because as you know, as we all know, the house itself isn't enough. It's the links into the community that are so important. In last November, I had the opportunity to go to Jordan, which is hosting about almost 2 million Syrian refugees in its country. 20% of its population are refugees, and visited the Al-Zahari refugee camp there and met a number of Syrian refugees who will be located to Ireland. So we've active missions, and later this month, I think about 80 Syrian refugees will be coming from Lebanon to Ireland. So 3,500 from Syria. Following the Afghan crisis last year, we provided refugee accommodation for 600 refugees. So these aren't going through international protection. These are people who have refugee status and all the benefits that flow from that. And whereas the response to Syria was part of a coordinated EU response, the response to Afghanistan was really Ireland standing on its own, because the international response to the crisis in Afghanistan wasn't good. And look, 600 is a small number in the scale of what happened in Afghanistan, but these were people who were particularly vulnerable. Female judges, human rights defenders, members of the LGBTI plus community, so people who are at particular risk from the attack of the Taliban. So I suppose I set those out in terms of our response to other refugee crises has been generous, and as you know, the issue of international protection and those who don't have status but are coming here seeking status is one the government are addressing through the white paper, through changes through the application system to make it go faster, so people can get an adjudication on their claim more quickly. But while they're waiting for that adjudication, improvements to their housing and their ability to integrate as well.